Toronto, 1961. A 26-year-old man is working a cleaning job in an office building. He earns about $4,000 a year. He owes roughly $6,000, which is more than he makes. He left school early, and he has no formal training in business of any kind. Nothing in his file suggests he is about to become anything. Then, a colleague hands him a book. It is a used copy of Think and Grow Rich, written by Napoleon Hill in 1937. He reads it. Then he reads it again. By his own account, he kept it with him and went back to it constantly for years. Within about a year, as he told it, his annual income had risen to roughly $175,000. Some years later, again by his own account, it passed $1 million. Those figures come from his own retelling, not from any independent audit, and it is worth holding them at that distance. But the outline of the life that followed is a matter of record. His name was Bob Proctor. He was born in 1934, and he died in February 2022. In between, he worked alongside Earl Nightingale and Lloyd Conant at Nightingale Conant, one of the largest personal development publishers in the world. He wrote You Were Born Rich in 1984. He appeared in the 2006 film The Secret, which put him in front of a global audience for the first time. He co-founded the Proctor Gallagher Institute with Sandy Gallagher and built a program called Thinking into Results. Here's the part that actually matters. Proctor spent the next 60 years arguing that what happened to him was not luck. He did not think it was positive thinking either, and he was unusually impatient with people who described it that way. He believed he had stumbled into the operation of a set of laws. Not rules of thumb, not attitudes, but laws he considered as consistent and as impersonal as gravity. Gravity does not check whether you believe in it before it acts on you. That was the comparison he returned to for the rest of his life. And that comparison is the reason he became something different from the motivational speakers around him. Most of that tradition sells the promise. Proctor spent his career reverse engineering the mechanism. He was the systematizer. So this video is going to do one thing. We are going to go through the laws as he taught them, one at a time. For each one, we will describe what he claimed it does, and then give a concrete example of what applying it actually looks like in an ordinary week. We will start with the idea he insisted came before all of them, because without it, he believed none of the laws could operate at all. One honest note before we begin. These are not laws of physics. They were never tested the way a physical law is tested, and calling them laws was a rhetorical choice on his part, not a scientific claim that survived review. What they are is a framework for how attention, belief, and behavior interact over time. Some of it maps closely onto things psychology understands well. Some of it does not, and we will say so when we get there. That distinction will be kept clear throughout. Because the interesting question is not whether Bob Proctor was right about the universe. The interesting question is why a framework this old, taught by a man with no credentials, kept producing changes in people who could not be reached any other way. That answer starts with a single word, and it is not a word he invented. Chapter 1. The Paradigm. Before any of the laws, Proctor taught one concept. He called it the paradigm, and he considered it the thing that actually controls the result. In his usage, a paradigm is a cluster of habits, assumptions, and beliefs that runs a person's behavior automatically. It is not a philosophy someone chose, it is a set of instructions that got installed. His account of the installation is straightforward. Most of it happens in early childhood, before a person has any capacity to evaluate what is arriving. Two things do the installing: repetition and emotional intensity. A phrase repeated at a child for 10 years becomes structural, because repetition is how the deeper mind accepts anything. A single frightening or humiliating moment can do the same work in 30 seconds, because emotional charge substitutes for repetition. Neither route requires the child's permission. By the time a person is old enough to examine any of it, the material has already been laid down and is running. That is the part he wanted people to sit with. The beliefs governing your behavior today were largely accepted by someone too young to argue with them. From there comes the claim that made his teaching different. The paradigm governs behavior far more than conscious intention does. Proctor argued this is why knowing better changes almost nothing. Information enters at the conscious level. Behavior is produced at a much deeper level. Those two levels are not the same system. and adding data to the first does not automatically rewrite the second, which explains something most people have experienced without a name for it. You can understand a problem completely and continue to do the thing anyway. He also argued this is why willpower fails on a long enough timeline. Willpower is conscious effort, and conscious effort is expensive. It works for a stretch, and then attention gets pulled elsewhere, and the moment it does, the older program is still there and takes the controls back. The paradigm never needed effort because it was never a decision. There is a mechanical distinction underneath all of this that he taught constantly. The conscious mind can accept an idea or reject it. That is what it is for, to evaluate, to compare, to say no. The deeper mind, in his teaching, has no rejecting function at all. It can only accept what is given to it, and then express it. So the question stops being whether an idea is true. The question becomes what has already been accepted and is currently being expressed. And it follows from this that repetition carried by emotion is the only lever that reaches down there. Reading a fact once does not. Understanding a concept does not. That is his explanation for why so much self-improvement material is consumed and then changes nothing. The material was delivered to the level that can reject, and it never reached the level that acts. Take a concrete case. Someone sets a goal on January 1st. They are going to train 4 times a week. They know exactly why it matters, and they mean it. For 3 weeks, the plan holds because conscious intention is fresh and the effort is available. Then a difficult week arrives at work. Attention gets consumed by something urgent, and the new routine is the first thing dropped. By mid-February, they are entirely back to the old pattern and slightly ashamed about it. Nothing about their knowledge changed in those 6 weeks. They did not become less informed or less sincere. What happened, in Proctor's reading, is that a 3-week-old conscious intention was competing against a 25-year-old automatic program, and it lost the moment supervision stopped. The paradigm did not fight them. It simply waited. Now the honest part. Paradigm is Proctor's reframing of ideas that were already old when he found them. Conditioning, self-image, the picture a person carries of what they are capable of. This territory was mapped long before him, and he was open about drawing on it. It also maps loosely onto things modern psychology does describe. Habit formation is real, and habits genuinely do run with very little conscious oversight. Implicit beliefs, the ones a person holds without having examined them, are a real and measurable phenomenon. Ego depletion, the older theory of willpower running out like fuel, has had a much harder time in replication and should not be leaned on. So the paradigm is not a scientific model. It is a serviceable metaphor with real observations inside it, and it should be used that way. That is where we start, because that is where he started. Every law that follows in this video only operates through the paradigm. Proctor's position was that you cannot apply a law with the conscious mind alone and expect it to hold, for exactly the reason the January goal collapsed. The law is the principle. The paradigm is the machinery it has to run on. Which is why he taught this first every time for 60 years. And it is why the first law is the one that describes how the machinery moves at all. Before we get to the first law, one short note, and then we go straight back. Everything Proctor taught sits inside a much older tradition. He never claimed otherwise. He was handed it by Napoleon Hill, who was handed it by people writing 30 years before him, and every one of them believed they were describing something that already existed rather than inventing it. If you want that whole lineage in one place, I wrote it down. It's called The Law of Attraction, what they actually taught. 8 teachers, a chapter each, Wallace Wattles through to Proctor himself. It covers the 5 things they all agreed on, and then the places where they flatly contradict each other, which almost nobody tells you about. There's a 30-day workbook with it that turns the method into daily practice. The link is in the description below. Now, the first law. The law of perpetual transmutation of energy. Stated simply, it says that energy is always moving into form, and that form is always dissolving back into energy. Nothing sits still. Everything you can see began as something you could not see. Proctor taught this as the first law for a reason. He wanted people to understand that an idea is not a passive thing you keep in storage. In his teaching, an image held steadily in the mind is already in motion toward physical expression. He drew a hard line between wishing and holding. A wish visits you and leaves. An image you return to daily is being carried, and in his framing, whatever is carried long enough eventually shows up in the visible world. That is why he insisted that picturing a result clearly was not a soft or decorative activity. He treated it as the opening stage of the result itself. Now the honest reading. This is not a law of physics, and it is not a claim about energy in the way a physicist would use that word. Energy does not gather around a mental picture and assemble into a house or a job offer. But strip the vocabulary away, and something real remains, and that part is worth taking seriously. A specific image, rehearsed repeatedly, changes three ordinary things. It changes what you notice, it changes what you attempt, and it changes what you keep doing on the days you do not feel like doing anything. A vague desire gives your attention nothing to lock onto. A precise picture acts like a filter, and once it is in place, relevant information starts surfacing that was always there and simply never registered. That is not mystical. That is how attention works. Consider two people who both want to leave their jobs. The first one holds a wish. She wants something better, something that feels less like a waste of her time. On a Tuesday evening, she is tired, the wish has no shape, and there is nothing specific to act on, so she watches television and the wish stays exactly where it was. The second one holds a picture of a particular working day. She has decided she wants to be doing operations work at a small logistics company. In her picture, she is at a desk by 9, the work is concrete, the team is 6 people, and she is home by 6. On the same Tuesday evening, she is equally tired. But the picture is specific enough to generate one obvious next move. She opens the site of a company she has already identified and reads about the operations role. It takes 20 minutes. She does it again on Thursday. Neither evening felt significant. 9 months later, she is in that job, and the difference was never willpower. The difference was that one of them had an image concrete enough to produce an action. Here is what to do with this. Take the outcome you say you want and describe an ordinary day inside it. Not the milestone, not the announcement, the ordinary Tuesday. Where are you at 10 in the morning? What is in front of you? Who are you speaking to? Write it down in plain language and read it before you start your week. The purpose is not to summon anything. The purpose is to make the target specific enough that your attention can find it. The law of vibration. Stated simply, it says that everything is in motion and that your thinking sets a mental state you can feel from the inside. Proctor treated this as the foundational law of the entire set, and he was explicit about something that almost every popular treatment gets wrong. The law of attraction is not the primary law. It is a secondary law that sits underneath this one. That distinction mattered enormously to him. The books and films that made this material famous put attraction at the center, and Proctor spent years correcting that in his own talks. His argument ran roughly like this: nothing rests, everything is in constant motion, and a human being is no exception. Thought puts you into a particular mental state. Feeling is not a separate event that happens to you. Feeling is simply how you become aware of the state you are already in. Which means, in his teaching, that emotion is a readout rather than a verdict. He was interested in that because a readout can be responded to. If you know you are in a poor state, you are no longer at the mercy of it. Now the part that has to be said plainly. The physics vocabulary here is borrowed. Frequency, vibration, and resonance are words with precise technical meanings, and this is not what those words mean. Your thoughts do not emit a frequency. Nothing you think is broadcast into the world, and no signal goes out and pulls matching circumstances toward you. Quantum mechanics is not an explanation for any of this, and anyone who tells you otherwise is reaching for authority they have not earned. That needs saying because the useful content survives without the borrowed vocabulary entirely. Here is what survives. Emotion is genuine information about your current internal state. That state is not fixed, and it is not the last word on reality. And you can change it deliberately, using breath, posture, attention, and a short, deliberate pause, instead of waiting passively to feel better. Your state also leaks. Other people read it in your face, your voice, and your timing, long before they process your words. That is not mysterious transmission. That is ordinary human social perception, and it is extremely fast. Consider a man walking into a performance review he expects to go badly. He has rehearsed the argument in his head on the drive in. By the time he sits down, his jaw is tight, his voice is clipped, and he is answering questions that have not been asked yet. His manager opened with a routine question and receives a defense. So the manager stiffens, becomes more formal, and the conversation hardens. Nothing in that room caused the difficulty except the state he carried through the door. Run it again with 90 seconds of preparation, and the same man arrives settled. Same facts, same feedback, entirely different conversation. The state he brought changed the response he got before either of them said anything meaningful. Here is what to do with this. Before anything that matters, take a state check. Stop for 30 seconds. Ask yourself one question. What state am I about to walk in with? Then breathe out slowly, drop your shoulders, and unclench your jaw. You are not summoning a frequency. You are arriving as the version of yourself the situation actually needs. The law of relativity. Stated simply, it says that nothing is large or small, good or bad, until you relate it to something else. Size is not a property of an event. Size is a comparison you are making, whether or not you notice you are making it. Proctor taught this as a discipline rather than a comfort. His point was that people rarely compare their problems to anything reasonable. Left alone, the mind reaches for the worst available reference and holds the trouble against that. A setback gets measured against ruin. An awkward conversation gets measured against being finished in your field. And because the comparison happens automatically, it feels like a perception rather than a choice. Proctor's answer was to make the comparison deliberate. If you are going to relate the problem to something, and you will, then select the reference yourself instead of accepting the first one that arrives. He thought this was the difference between a person who recovers in an afternoon and a person who loses a month. The honest reading is that this is a reframing practice. That is not a downgrade. Reframing is one of the better evidence tools in ordinary psychology, and it sits at the center of several mainstream therapeutic approaches for good reason. The mechanism is not mysterious. An event arrives, you appraise it, and the appraisal is what generates the emotional response. Change the appraisal, and the response changes with it. That is real, it is measurable, and it does not require any borrowed physics. But this one needs care. Reframing is not the same as dismissing. Some things are genuinely large. A serious illness, a bereavement, losing your housing. These do not shrink because you compared them to something worse. And telling a person in real difficulty that their problem is only a matter of perspective is a cruelty dressed as wisdom. The honest version is narrower and more useful. Most daily distress comes from ordinary setbacks measured against catastrophic references. Relativity is a tool for that specific error. It is not a tool for grief. Consider a freelance designer who loses a client on a Thursday morning. Within an hour, she has decided her business is failing. She is not doing arithmetic, she is comparing the loss to total collapse, and against that reference, the loss looks enormous. That evening, she opens her accounts and looks at the actual year. The client was 11% of her income. She has taken on 4 new clients in the same 12 months. 2 existing clients expanded their work with her in spring. The loss is real, and she will need to replace it. But related to the actual scale of her year, it is a normal fluctuation in a business that is growing, not evidence of collapse. The facts never changed, the reference point did, and it changed how she spent the next 2 weeks. Here is what to do with this. When something goes wrong, do not ask how bad it is. Ask what you are comparing it to. Then find a real reference point, a number, a record, a span of time you can actually check. Relate the problem to that, rather than to the worst version of itself. If it is still large after an honest comparison, then it is genuinely large, and you now know that too. The law of polarity. Everything that exists has an opposite, and the two are ends of the same thing. Hot and cold are not separate substances. They're the same measurement read at different points on one scale. Proctor took that observation and made it practical. His working version was that every difficulty carries an opportunity of roughly the same size. He didn't mean this as comfort, he meant it as instruction. When something went wrong, the assignment was to go looking, deliberately, for what the new situation made possible that the old one didn't. He thought it mattered because of what most people do instead. Most people meet a setback by replaying it. They run the conversation again, adjust their answers, and arrive at the same ending. Proctor's argument was that this is a use of the mind that produces nothing. The search for the opposite pole was his way of pointing attention somewhere it could actually do work. Now the honest reading. This is not a law of physics. Polarity in physics describes charge and magnetic orientation. It says nothing about human misfortune, and borrowing the word doesn't transfer the authority. But the practice underneath it has a real name in psychology: benefit finding. It's been studied in people recovering from illness, from bereavement, from job loss, and it holds up reasonably well. The mechanism isn't mystical. Rumination is a closed loop that keeps distress active without moving you anywhere. Searching for what's newly possible is an open task, and an open task recruits problem-solving instead. The gain comes from where your attention goes, not from any balance built into the universe. One caution, and it's important. Some things are simply losses: a death, a serious diagnosis, a betrayal by someone you trusted. These do not contain a hidden gift of equal weight, and telling someone they do is a cruelty dressed as wisdom. So hold the smaller, truer version. Don't ask what this was for. Ask what's possible now that wasn't possible last month. That question has an honest answer even when the situation is genuinely bad. Here's what it looks like in an ordinary life. A woman is made redundant on a Tuesday morning after 9 years. She has 6 weeks of notice pay and a great deal of unstructured time. She can spend those 6 weeks rehearsing the meeting, refining what she should have said, and testing whether she was singled out. At the end of that, she'll have a very detailed account of a room she'll never sit in again. Or she can spend the same 6 weeks on a plain question: what does having my weekdays back actually permit? For her, it permitted 3 things: contacting 11 people she'd never had time to call, sitting the certification she'd deferred twice, testing whether the freelance work she'd done on evenings could carry a full week. Same 6 weeks, same loss. Entirely different inventory at the end of it. Here's the instruction. Take a sheet of paper and draw a line down the middle. On the left, write the difficulty in 1 sentence, plainly, without softening it. On the right, list only the specific things that are now available to you and weren't before. Be concrete: time, access, freedom from an obligation, permission to stop pretending. If the right side is empty, leave it empty and come back in a week. An honest blank is worth more than a comforting invention. The law of rhythm. Everything moves in cycles, and nothing holds a single state indefinitely. The tide goes out, then the tide comes back. Seasons turn. Markets rise and fall. Energy lifts and then drops. Proctor used this one for a specific purpose, and it wasn't decorative. He taught it as protection against quitting at the bottom of a cycle. His reasoning ran roughly like this. The low part of any cycle feels like a verdict. It doesn't feel like weather. It feels like a permanent report on who you are and what you're capable of. And people act on that feeling. They close the business in the flat month. They abandon the practice in the week it stops producing. Proctor's point was that the decision itself was made by the trough, not by the evidence. He wanted people to recognize the shape of the cycle while they were standing in the worst part of it. The honest reading. Rhythm is not a universal law in any scientific sense. Physics has oscillation, biology has circadian and seasonal cycles, and economics has business cycles, but these are separate phenomena with separate causes. They aren't one principle wearing 3 costumes. What's genuinely true is narrower and still useful. Performance fluctuates, mood fluctuates, motivation fluctuates. Results arrive unevenly and often with a lag. And there's a well-documented human tendency to treat the current state as the permanent state. When you feel flat, the future looks flat. When you feel capable, the future looks open. That's a real bias, and it means people routinely make permanent decisions out of temporary conditions. There's a practical consequence worth naming. The low part of a cycle is exactly when your old story sounds most persuasive. The conditioning Proctor called a paradigm doesn't argue with you on a good day. It waits. It speaks up in the 5th flat week, and it speaks calmly, and it sounds like realism. So the rule follows. Your assessment of whether something is working is least reliable at precisely the moment it feels most obvious. That's the whole practical value of this idea. Consider a man 5 weeks into something new. He's been building an evening business after work. He's sent the emails, made the calls, put the thing in front of people. Nothing has come back. Not rejection, just silence. and a question arrives, sounding perfectly reasonable. Is this failing, or am I simply in the flat part? Those two situations feel absolutely identical from the inside. If he decides in week 5, he decides on a feeling. If he'd written down in week 1 what failure would actually look like, he'd have something to check the feeling against. Maybe that was 60 conversations with fewer than 2 people asking a follow-up question. Maybe it was 3 months with no repeat interest. At week 5 with 22 conversations, the honest answer is that he doesn't have the data yet. Here's the instruction. Before you start something, decide in advance what evidence would genuinely mean stop. Write it down. Make it specific enough that you could tick it or not tick it. A number of attempts, a length of time, a signal you'd expect to have seen by then. Then, when the flat week arrives, and it will, you consult the page instead of your mood. The point isn't to never quit. The point is that a bad week shouldn't get to make that decision on your behalf. The law of cause and effect. Every effect has a cause, and nothing in your results arrived from nowhere. Proctor taught this one as ownership. His position was that what shows up in your life is downstream of what you've been consistently doing and consistently believing. Not what you did once, what you've been doing for years without particularly noticing. He treated the results as the readout and the habits and beliefs as the input. We need to handle the danger in this idea directly because it's real. Taken too far, cause and effect becomes victim blaming. It becomes the claim that illness is self-caused, that poverty is a thought pattern, that the person who was harmed somehow summoned it. That is false. It's also cruel, and it has done genuine damage inside the personal development world. People get sick for reasons of genetics, exposure, and chance. People are poor because of where they were born, what they inherited, what the labor market did, and what happened to them before they had any say in it. No amount of correct thinking rewrites those causes. If a teaching implies otherwise, the teaching is wrong on the facts. So here's the narrower version, which is honest and still worth having. Within the range of things you actually control, results tend to be lawful rather than random. Not guaranteed, not proportional, but connected to inputs in a way you can trace. And this is good news, because a lawful thing can be changed and a random thing can't. If your outcome is pure luck, there's nothing to do but wait. If some meaningful portion of it runs through repeated behavior, then behavior is a lever. Notice what this version doesn't claim. It doesn't say thought influences matter at a distance. It doesn't invoke energy or frequency or anything from physics. The chain is ordinary. Belief shapes what you attempt. Attempting shapes what you practice. Practice shapes what you're capable of, and capability shows up in results. Every link in that chain is boring and observable. Take a man whose income hasn't moved in 4 years. Same figure, adjusted for nothing, 4 years running. The comfortable explanation is the market, or the industry, or bad timing. But he sat down and traced it back, and what he found wasn't dramatic. He'd never asked for a raise, not once. He'd assumed good work would be noticed and rewarded on its own schedule. He'd turned down 2 projects that would have stretched him because they arrived in busy months, and he'd spoken to nobody outside his own team in about 3 years. None of those are moral failures. They're small, repeated, entirely invisible from inside the week they happen. But 4 years of them produce exactly the result he was looking at. The luck explanation offered him nothing to do. The causal one offered him 3 things. Here's the instruction. Pick one recurring result you don't like. 1. Something that shows up again and again. Then ask what single repeated behavior is most likely sitting upstream of it. Not the whole tangle of causes, just the one you could plausibly change this month. Be honest and be fair to yourself at the same time. Some of what happens to you isn't yours, but some of it is, and that's the part worth working on. Every seed has a gestation period. An acorn does not become an oak because you are watching it. It becomes an oak because time passes underground while nothing appears above the soil. Proctor applied that image to ideas. He taught that a goal planted in the mind behaves the way a seed behaves in the earth. There is an interval between the planting and the appearing. And most people, he argued, abandon their idea somewhere inside that interval because nothing visible has arrived yet. Read honestly. This is a lesson about lag. Behavior change produces internal change long before it produces external results. The first month of a new practice mostly rearranges you. Your attention shifts, your standards move, Your tolerance for the old routine drops. None of that shows up on a bank statement or a scale or a sales report. The gap between the inward change and the outward one is where almost everyone quits. The limitation is worth stating plainly, because Proctor's version of this law is often sold without it. Unlike a seed, an idea has no fixed and knowable gestation period. Corn takes about 90 days. A human pregnancy takes about 40 weeks. A career change takes as long as it takes, and no one can tell you the number in advance. This law gives you no timetable. Anyone who hands you one is guessing, and usually guessing in a way that suits their own deadline rather than yours. What the law offers instead is permission to keep going while the ground still looks empty. Picture two people who begin the same practice on the same Monday. Same goal, same routine, same amount of time available. The first measures by outcome. Every few days, she checks whether the result has arrived. By week 6, she has checked perhaps 20 times and been told no perhaps 20 times. The practice has become a source of evidence that it is not working. She stops, and her stopping feels like realism. The second measures by input. She tracks whether she did the thing, not whether it paid. By week 6, her record shows 31 sessions completed out of 42 days. The result has not arrived for her either. But her evidence says the practice is intact, so she continues. And the difference between these two women at week 6 is not talent or luck. It is what they agreed to count. So the practical instruction is simple. Track what you did, not what arrived. Write the input down on the day you complete it, in a form you cannot argue with later. Inputs are the only part of this you actually control. They are also the only honest early signal you have, because outcomes lag and inputs do not. Then, set a review date far enough out that you are not checking the soil every morning. 90 days is a reasonable interval for most practices, though the number matters less than the fact that you chose it in advance rather than in a low moment. The law of gender, in the end, is a law of patience with a specific shape, not vague hope, not waiting for the universe to deliver. Just the recognition that growth has an invisible phase, and that quitting during the invisible phase is the most common way a good idea dies. So what do you actually do with all of this? 7 laws is a lot of philosophy for a Tuesday. What follows is the whole video compressed into a practice you could start tonight, in 6 steps. Step 1. Get specific about the result. Specific enough that a stranger with no knowledge of your life could look at your situation and tell you plainly whether it had happened. More confident fails that test. Ran the Thursday meeting without reading from my notes, passes it. The vagueness most people call a goal is really a way of avoiding the verdict. Step 2. Write the goal down and notice what argues back. There is almost always a sentence that surfaces within a few seconds. You are too old for this. People like you don't do that. You tried something similar in 2019 and it went badly. That objection is the paradigm speaking, and it is not an obstacle to the work. It is the work. Write the objection down beside the goal, because a belief you have written out is far easier to examine than one that only whispers. Step 3. Change your state deliberately before the moments that matter. Do not wait to feel ready, because readiness is a result of action far more often than a cause of it. 2 minutes of standing up, breathing slowly, and walking around the room before a difficult call is not a mystical intervention. It is you choosing the mood you will bring into the room, instead of accepting whichever mood happened to be there. Step 4. Rehearse the finished picture, briefly and often. 60 seconds is enough. See the specific scene of the goal already completed, with the detail of a real memory rather than a poster. The quiet minutes before sleep are unusually good for this, because the mind is already loose and the day is done arguing with you. This is not a substitute for the work. It is preparation for it, in the same way an athlete walks the course before the race. Step 5. Act on the nearest evidence. Ask what the smallest thing is that a person who already had this result would do today, and then do that one thing. Not the whole transformation, the nearest piece of it. Send the message, open the document, make the appointment. Behavior is the only part of this system that touches the world, and every other step is in service of it. Step 6. Measure inputs, not outcomes, and expect the lag. Keep the record of what you did, review it on a date you chose in advance, and let the invisible phase be invisible without treating it as failure. That is the practice. 6 steps, none of them complicated, all of them harder than they sound at 6 a.m. on a bad week. One honest closing frame before we finish. These are not laws of physics. Nothing here overrides gravity or thermodynamics, and the older literature borrowed scientific language it had no real claim to. What these ideas actually describe is a practical psychology of attention, belief, and behavior. Practitioners noticed the patterns and taught them for decades before the research vocabulary existed to name them properly. That reading makes them more useful rather than less, because a psychology can be tested, adjusted, and applied by anyone, while a mystery can only be believed. And a word of care. Nothing in this video replaces medical treatment, or a therapist, or a professional who knows your particular situation. Circumstances differ wildly. Some people are carrying far more weight than others, through no failure of thought, and no attitude adjustment makes that untrue. Use what is useful here, leave what is not. You already know which of the 6 steps you have been avoiding. Start there, quietly, tonight. The ground does its work in the dark.